All right, well, man, we are so stoked to have Matt Ehret with us today. Um, we don't always do a lot of these kind of things, but we're starting to open up to the public more so. And we met Matt a little while ago. I met him. Actually, Matt, I never told you, but I met you through Robert David Steele. And that's how well, at least that's how I saw you. And when I saw you, so I've been watching you since 2020 and or 2020. And it's been phenomenal for me to start to revisit so much of history that gets glossed over or whitewashed in different ways. And it's encouraging to have somebody like yourself who's done the study and can be so eloquent at sharing. Like every time you share one of your stories or some of your history, it's like you're painting a masterpiece for us, so you truly are an artist in your own right. I just wanted to say that to you, and I want to pass it over to Brandi so she can give the people out there your credits, you might say.
Oh, right. Well, thank you, Matt, for being with us today and giving us some of your valuable time. We believe that time multiplied times energy equals art, and you are definitely sharing your art with us today. And you're the editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review and co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation with your beautiful and brilliant wife, Cynthia Chung. And really just looking forward to our discussion on peace, prosperity, and progress. And Vinny, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so we definitely want you to explore a bit of the history of peace, progress, and prosperity, but we were wanting to go back to that period, you might call it now the Second Silk Road, or when the Silk Road was once again revived, over in Asia.
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, your viewers, and thank you guys. I really appreciate what you guys are doing. I love your spirit. And if the audience wonders at some point why it is that you and I have similar t-shirts.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, well, I just received this wonderful gift from you guys this morning, so I decided what better way to have a conversation but with your organizations. I guess this is your organization, right? Or this is just a personal pet project that you decided to make this imagery.
No, you got it.
Yeah.
Well, our organization is the Alternative Educational Alliance, and we did recently create it as a ministry. So we are the AEA Ministries, and it's a vision that I had 30 years ago to create this organization. And now that we're going public with it, the actual artwork, Manifest Essence, was done by our dear friend, VCJ, who's a skateboard artist and a dear friend of ours. And so he basically allowed us to use it for our website. And we just love to share it with people.
It's a great little design. So anyway, yeah, that explains why we have the match. As far as the question that you raised to kickstart this whole discussion, and thank you for that introduction, really warm. On the issue of the Silk Road, yeah, that is such an important part not only of the current world dynamic, because as I've made the point in a lot of my interviews in my book series that I've co-authored with my wife, Cynthia, the world is really being pulled into two different futures, two different ideas of the way natural law operates, the way that human systems must function in accordance with certain ideals. The difference being that one system, one paradigm, which is vying for dominance in the new, what will come online to replace the currently dying order. And anybody watching this wondering like, what do you mean our order is dying? Yeah, our order, the financial system that we've been living in, that we were born into, is a time bomb that is melting down. It is collapsing. We're living through that. So there's a vying over who and what will influence that new system. One system, I think a lot of people are probably aware, most people watching this are probably aware, is a disgusting, ugly perversion of anything trying to be natural law. It is premised on certain ideas of human nature, certain ideas of government, certain ideas of the universe that are embedded into the idea that we're overpopulated. The new system has to be governed by a massive behavioral modification to transform global society's values into something which is in accordance with a slave class that would go along with or even desire their own undoing, their own reduction of living standards, getting rid of the idea of ownership of property, the idea of having abundance. Those are supposed to be the expectations of the past obsolete age, and the new age is an age of scarcity. It's an age of misanthropy, where we think of ourselves as as the viruses that we really are, right? Carrying around a nice, healthy guilt complex from a really young age.
Yeah.
And so that's just a really ugly thing. It's premised on certain other things, like the need for dismantling any type of ancient civilizational traditions, any forces that tie us to our idea of God, the creator, as something beyond our limited atomized identities. The idea of the family unit also has to be dismantled. This has been a thing which has been going on for a long time, right? And the idea of the nation state, the idea of nationalism in a healthy sense. There's obviously unhealthy versions of nationalism. We've seen Hitler. Now, I would say that that's not really nationalism. That's a fascist form of oligarchism masquerading as nationalism with some blood and soil cultish biases. But that's what we're told in school. Even that is all nationalism is
Exactly.
So there's something more to it. That's obviously hyper simplistic and wrong. There's something that does scare the hell out of the oligarchy about this idea of sovereign nation states and our ability to tune our own identity to the general welfare. Like JFK said, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That was emblematic of the better way of thinking of a nationalism that scares empire, which is what, when you take all that into consideration, has a label Great Reset, in opposition to that, the other more healthy system vying for influence and dominance in that new replacement architecture is the multipolar alliance. It is not premised on depopulation at all. When you look at Russia, China, India, Iran, other countries working in that Eurasian zone, they're representing diverse ancient civilizations. They're putting online projects to pull people out of poverty, over 800 million of whom have been pulled out of poverty just in China alone, but they're extending that model to other countries in Africa and beyond, so that other countries have the ability to stand on their own 2 feet and feed themselves with their own industrial base, their own engineering and educational base, to create new generations of specialists, instead of just having, like we've been doing in the West, mining cartels going in, raping Africa and giving them nothing in return, except for maybe a small coterie of elites that we allow to be like local governors that are highly corrupt, right? In an organized crime syndicate in Kenya or Nigeria or Congo or wherever in the world. That's what the empire does by creating fifth columns of encrusted organized crime beholden to a higher power. So China's approach is very different on so many levels. It is empowering sovereign nation states. It is defending these ancient civilizational forces within their cultures that they don't want to sacrifice. And the form that it is taking as a living expression has been known as the Belt and Road Initiative. It has been one term that was used by Xi Jinping in 13 for the first time in October at an event in Kazakhstan. And it's otherwise come to be known as well as the New Silk Road. And the New Silk Road is now, it's grown a lot since 2013. It's a very flexible, modular managerial system, which does involve central government. It does involve national banks, not private banks, but it does involve like a lot of powerful federal governments that wield power, which scares a lot of Westerners who've just seen that type of thing misused so much. So a lot of people, they're like, oh, central power, that means that they're oligarchic, tyrannical, and evil. Not really, because if you look at what they do with that power, so power is not a thing unto itself. It's power for what? It's actually transmitting large-scale infrastructure investments into things that are breathtaking, like the size of like something like 20 Marshall Plans is what we've now been seeing all over Eurasia, Africa, and beyond. So it's increasing longevity, quality of life, quality of education, empowering nations. And like I said, this whole thing is premised on originally an east-west transit corridor, systems of high-speed rail, conventional rail roads, and development complexes going from east to west, but also with nodes going through the Middle East, through Pakistan, into Afghanistan, into Iran, into Iraq and Syria as part of a reconstruction program, into Africa, with Ethiopia being a key node. That's why there's regime change targeting Ethiopia right now, and there has been for about a year and a half. That's why Pakistan has just been ousted. Their government under Imran Khan has been ousted under a U.S. coup just this week, because he's playing too positive of a role in that broader chemistry. But this didn't come out of 2013. Despite that, it's a very powerful process. It's very creative, very anti-entropic. That means like it's open to create more wealth than you use. More energy in the system is created over time than is used in the system at any given moment. That's the definition in a simple sense of anti-entropy. Entropy is just the system that defines all systems as being closed, as always consuming more energy than it produces, like a machine or an engine of a car that's always going to be using more gas, right? So there'll always be less gas as the pistons move and burn, heat, or cause heat to make the system work, so that it's always approaching a heat death. So that's the difference. Our system here is governed by the logic of entropy, that there's a closed system of heat death defining our future, which is why they're all obsessed with, the oligarchy in the West is obsessed with depopulation. In the East, not so. So back to your original question. Okay, so this didn't come from nowhere. The Silk Road idea was a revival of an ancient Chinese foreign policy that first arose in 200 or so BC, before the Common Era, or before Christ. And it was something that emerged out of the early Han Dynasty. And that was a unifying period in the case of China, that came out of the Warring States period, where you had these different, warlords pretty much vying for dominance with different subgroupings in China for a very long time. It was a period of chaos, the Warring States. It was, the name says it all. So coming out of that, there was a unifying process where one of the groups took a dominant position, but their view wasn't to then suppress or have a totalitarian slave state, as some other groups did want. The Han grouping saw a giant Confucian revival, so they brought in Confucianism as their governing philosophy. There's a lot of parallels to Christianity in that sense, and Christ's teachings, in terms of the idea, some of the core principles of Confucianism involve the idea of doing not unto others as you would not have them do unto you. It's kind of like the inversion of Christ, do unto others, right? The golden rule, the idea of Ren, of an agapic love that is our true nature with our fellow men and women. The idea of Li as a sense of principle in the universe that organizes everything. The idea of a mandate of heaven that the Confucians abide by, that man's law is only legitimate to the degree that it abides by the mandate of heaven, God's law. Right. And to the degree that it defies that, it loses its validity. And that's why people like Mencius, the follower of Confucius, is seen as a revolutionary or reactionary by people who only like order, because it's like, it puts a lot of power into the people. So that's what came about as a governing philosophy, and coming out of that was this idea of looking outward beyond your border. And the Silk Road originally came about as this idea of, okay, well, let's have communion with the Arab states. Let's begin to build a relationship with even the early Romans of the Roman Republic, and have commerce going east-west. That also involved India, that involved Africa as well, through the maritime version of the Silk Road. So it had an overland and maritime base.
And was this also the time when like the houses of wisdom were coming together? Like, was that at the beginning?
Not yet. That came later.
Okay.
So the houses of wisdom are vitally important, but that's something that occurred only after. So this first expression of the Silk Road.
Okay, you're still in the previous one. Okay.
Yeah, the first. Right. So I guess version 1.0.
Silk Road. 1.0.
And maybe there were other ones previous, that have been scrubbed out of history. That's possible, because there's a lot of our deep history that has been erased.
Yeah.
That also indicate that people like Pythagoras were studying in India, that India was like a fountain of great learning and knowledge, that ties into many of the things that were going on in Greece in the time of Solon.
Right.
So, but that's stuff that's tough to talk about because it's been so deconstructed. Maybe that's for the future historians to piece that together. But all that to say, this lasted for about 400 years, and it was only with the collapse of the Han Dynasty in around 200 AD that that the Silk Road foreign policy of exchange, cultural exchange, inventions, other things dismantled itself, and Asia went into a state of turmoil for a few centuries. And that turmoil endured until about the period of 640, 650 AD, when a new government was able to take power in China, and they restored the Silk Road. And this was the Tang Dynasty. It went on from about 650 all the way up until the beginning of the Song Dynasty in the early 10th century. So that the Tang Dynasty basically said, okay, we're going to revive the spirit of commerce, of interrelations with the East. And, there was a lot that came out of that. It's a highly dense period of potential. One of the things was with the Muslim world, before the Tang Dynasty was able to gain full control of the different territories that they had gained control of from the warlords that had taken over for a couple hundred years. There was an insurgency. There was a civil war. It was called the Anshi Rebellion. And one of the leading generals had a giant army at his disposal, and he had illusions of grandeur, and he wanted to just be the emperor. So this thing started a giant civil war, a big bloodbath, and it almost dismantled the early Tang Dynasty before it could even learn to walk. And the thing that came in and saved it was in a negotiation, an agreement with the newly formed Abbasid dynasty of I think it was the father or the grandfather of Harun al-Rashid. And what was arranged was that the Muslims who had gained, they were a brand new religion at that time. Muhammad had just recently died. And so they had developed a military capability, and they said, okay, well, we will defend you. And they deployed something like 10,000 soldiers to China to help fight against the uprisings of the Anshi Rebellion, and succeeded. And as a reward, they were given territory, land to settle in Eastern China. This became the basis. This is the reason why the Chinese have a big Muslim population in the West. I said East, I meant West. And that's the Uyghur region today. So that's there. So they saved China, and by saving it and keeping it whole, and integrating into the civilization, the Silk Road was able to be revived. And coming out of this was, again, a new unification, as really a positive ecumenical process of these various faiths and various ethnic groups from the period of Harun al-Rashid at the end of the 8th century AD. That's sort of the high period of the Renaissance of the Abbasids, but also of a new Frankish king. So the Roman Empire had already recently collapsed, right? In around 450, it was the final death knell. The Vandals, the Goths took over, the Visigoths. And it had already broken up into an East and a West to just try to kind of stay alive, kind of like your body and going into hyperthermia, and you got to pick which organs are going to stay alive, which will be sacrificed. So that was sort of like the Roman Empire body. And the Eastern one is a little bit more stable in that sense. The Western one was a corrupt basket case of Satanism. It didn't have the moral ability to sustain itself. Even though you had people like St. Augustine who were trying to reintroduce some creative moral vitality into it, it wasn't enough. And so that had disassembled itself. As I said, the Goths, the Visigoths, they basically created a confederation of not even a confederation, a whole bunch of little mini little micro empires where the Western Empire used to be. So it was a state of chaos. Each person was vying for power, constant little mini wars as it happens. And the Roman oligarchy, who's the key theme in the story, because the thing that connects this to today's present in terms of what is the continuity of evil you got to see that it's the same thing that controlled the mystery schools, the banks, the ideological systems of the Roman Empire. This evil, rapacious empire of slavery, exploitation, and cult formation. Like we're talking like really bad stuff here, like baby sacrificing stuff was going on in some of these mystery schools of the Roman Empire. These families that managed that, or the beneficiaries of that, they migrated after Rome collapsed, the Western Roman Empire collapsed, to a new center of command, which became Venice. Venice was the sort of reorganized Roman Empire.
Yeah.
When it took a few hundred years for them to start really like reconstructing themselves. And in that period of chaos where they didn't establish themselves properly, there was a lot of space that was given for the Augustinian humanists, the Augustinian forces in Europe, to move where they couldn't move prior. So despite that, the Venetians became a system of corruption, of funding. Like it was a center of bullion, silver monopolies, international maritime trade for a few centuries. And even early on, they were still funding all sides to try to get maximum chaos, to try to manage the chaos. They're also working with I won't go into too many tangents if I can avoid it.
But they were also had control over a lot of like the intelligence operations, right? The Venetians back then, right? Like I found that.
Well, that specialization started coming in more. They became more later. A little bit later, yeah. After around the 10th century, 11th century, that's when they started really getting the handle on the mastery of their intelligence operations. They still had it though, yeah, but it wasn't as high level as it became.
This was more in their transition from Rome declining, and where were they going to end up?
Okay, right when they were getting resettled.
They resettled in Venice, exactly. And then. But then Charlemagne put a bit of a what do you say, a
wrench in it.
Yeah, put a wrench in it, you know.
Big time, because he was able to unify. So he was like one of the many. There was like 8 different local warlords vying for control, all fighting each other. But the Frankish grouping, which was where the Augustinian forces concentrated themselves, had a much more viable moral and basically wise plan, and they were able to basically take control. They established for the first time a unified system. They beat out all of the smaller warlords. They established kind of like what had happened in China in the 200s after the Warring States period. You finally had a unifying harmonizing principle under the Han Dynasty. That's sort of what Charlemagne was. And with that new sense of peace and stability, you also had an unleashing of and this is Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Great. Actually, they call him Pepin the Small. It was, I guess, not the best subtitle, but anyway, he was a really great guy. And, he unleashed a process of training orphans for the first time, not treating people like they're human cattle, but really focusing on giving state backing to monasteries that were training little children from low-level families, low level in the eyes of the elite, to become brilliant geniuses and do transcriptions of ancient manuscripts. So it wasn't just literacy, it was really like synthesizing the best of human knowledge into this new generation that became the intelligentsia. Also internal improvements, the idea of now that there's no wars or big serious wars, you now have this ability to use your treasuries to invest in internal improvements, water systems, canals, roads, schools, hospitals, things like that. So it was a really glorious period in many ways under Charlemagne, especially. This came to an apogee. And Charlemagne had a brilliant, the modern historians tend to make the mistake of treating Charlemagne as a self-contained unit outside of a global context, or the Abbasid dynasty of his contemporary Harun al-Rashid, who was also the son of a great leader, as a self-contained thing, or the Tang Dynasty as a self-contained thing. And it's like, it's not right to do that. You can't understand any part unless you see the whole, right?
But that's kind of their point, right? Like they don't want people putting it together, but that you have to put it together in order to get the real story.
Yeah, exactly. Context is everything. So, and definitely not Venice. Venice has worked really hard at sponsoring researchers over the centuries to write them out of the equation. So this gets into, I think, the most controversial thing I'm about to say is, why do people not see the role of Venice? So even people looking at this process, before I say the controversial thing, let me just say this. The ecumenical alliance was incredible. So you had Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid working on together. They were maintaining the Silk Road, this system of commerce and trade. Also, Chinese inventions were going west, and inversely, insights and discoveries of the West were going east into China. So it was a really vibrant period of creative vitality, cross-pollination of ideas. And also with that comes also an ability to see the humanity in your neighbor, even if they have a different religion or language,
Right.
which empires hate, because that makes it harder for us to go to war or willingly accept a war with our neighbors, which is the technique of empire. So you had that happening. The houses of wisdom that you pointed out are beautiful. These were like the Platonic academies that were sponsored by both the southern, because you had the Umayyad dynasty of Islam, and you had the Abbasid dynasty. So there were two separate dynasties coexisting and vying for political supremacy, right, over the Islamic world. The Umayyads were ousted from the Middle East, the heartland, so-called, at a certain point by the Abbasids, and the Umayyads' new center of focus became southern Spain, or all of Spain. That's why the things like later on the what some call the Muslim or the Islamic Renaissance occurred in Spain, or one of the Renaissances occurred in Spain under the 11th, 12th century, when the rest of Europe was in a total dark age of medievalism and war. They were going through this blossoming of science and discovery and medicine and everything, but it was already vibrant back then too. And these houses of wisdom at the time were centered in Baghdad under the Abbasids, and these were not specifically Muslim. You had an open door policy inviting scholars from the Christian world, from the Jewish world. Asians were invited in, Buddhists were invited in to all study astronomy together, study mathematics, geometry, poetry, which were all seen as different sides of the same thing. Not like today, where all of these, the arts and the sciences have been artificially schismed. Back then, they didn't have that problem so much. And it was just a wonderful, again, just super dense discoveries. And there were a lot of these houses of wisdom that were sponsored by the Abbasids all over the place.
Wow.
Diplomatically speaking, to avoid the wars between Christian and Muslim worlds, which were already then the Venetians were trying to instigate. It took them a few centuries more to start to really get it off the ground with the crusades, again, sponsored by Venice.
Yeah.
They were trying earlier on, but not succeeding. Why? Well, one great example of that, there's this beautiful example that I cite in my new book, where Harun al-Rashid basically says, okay, to Charlemagne, instead of going to war over the Holy Land, how about this? He sends a giant delegation of gifts of gold, this big elephant from the Middle East, into Charlemagne's kingdom as a gift. And with this giant gift comes a deed. And he says, okay, this deed is the Holy Land, Jerusalem. It's yours. We're giving it to you. You don't have to go to war. It's yours, and we will guard it. So we'll be the custodians guarding and protecting it, and it's yours. And it worked really nicely. Brilliant idea.
Yeah.
So you had this whole thing going on. And keep in mind, again, the Muslims are also in China, providing the defense of China as a state, providing the defense of the Silk Road corridors from bandits and other things. Very interesting stuff. So now you get us into the controversy. So why don't people look at the role of Venice as the continuity of the Roman Empire, which itself comes out of the Babylonian Empire, all the way up until the Venetians migrated a few centuries later after the Renaissance into taking over the British Isles and the Dutch area, the Netherlands, to the point that today these same family groups, these same power structures using the same techniques with the same cult formations, the same banking operations, maybe a bit more complex, are today at the heart of this takeover of the USA since JFK was killed, as well as basically the whole Great Reset. If you look at all of this stuff, it's really that. It's trying to create a new Roman Empire.
Yeah.
So why don't people understand this more clearly? Well, there's been a few, on the one hand, like I said, in some cases, many history books have just written them out of existence. So you don't even get to look at that. On the other hand, these same books tend to do what I just said. They myopicize, they get us to become very myopic and specialized in looking at one part of the world in time without a whole. The other thing, for those who do tend to look at a whole, you know, call us the conspiracy theorists, right? People who think a little bit more critically outside the box about narratives. There's been special solutions, special explanatory models of history provided for them too, as fish that jump out of the pond, the controlled pond, and into another controlled pond. And that gives us now the issue of the evil Khazarian Mafia.
Gotta go there.
Gotta go there.
Yeah,
So, yeah. So I know you guys probably want to touch on that a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Let's go there. Okay. So the Khazarian Mafia is something that, as far as I can tell, has been presented first. I think the first person to really showcase this Jewish kingdom that coexisted around the time of Charlemagne, Harun al-Rashid, the Tang Dynasty, the Silk Road. This Jewish kingdom that occupies much of today's Ukraine, some of Russia around the Black Sea region, some of Central Europe below that. That's sort of the Khazarian kingdom geographical region. Its borders are in Charlemagne's kingdom. On one hand, it also bordered the Islamic world. On the other hand, it was tied directly to the Chinese systems, or the Chinese sphere of influence in its east. And it was a zone which was strategic in that early Silk Road Tang Dynasty revival. It was called the Steppes Silk Road. So you had several key transit points, south, middle, and also a northern one through today's Russia that passed directly through Khazaria into Europe. Now, the Khazarian Mafia thesis that was posited first by David Icke, and then it was taken up by a variety of other conspiracy researchers, says that this is the center of global evil. This is why you have Jewish bankers like the Rothschilds, the Goldsmiths, the Montefiore, the Sassoons. And it's like, sure, like anybody like trying to piece together the lies of our current age will not take long before they encounter the fact that there are broader conspiracies. There are indeed a tendency to encounter Jewish dynastic mercenary families, or at least with Jewish names, doing bad things all across recent history for a few centuries here.
Right.
The Rothschilds just being one of the more well-known of the coterie of these groups. That they tend to wield a lot of financial wealth. Oftentimes they have Zionist, or they always have a certain variety of political Zionism that they're promoting and that they're advancing. And you know, it's tied to narcotics trades, it's tied to usury, tied to all sorts of bad things. Then the question is, okay, why? So that's the big question. Why are there such a consistent amount of Jewish family dynasties, or at least with Jewish names, that are conducting mercenary type operations to maintain empire for many generations? Why is that? Where did that come from? Now, the Khazarian Mafia thesis that was again posited by David Icke in the late 90s, and then it sort of grew, and now it's like really big in the conspiracy community, is that this all came from Khazaria, this zone that's kind of painted like, if anybody has watched Lord of the Rings or read the books, Mordor, you know, the zone of orcs and orcai, that only is pure evil, right? You don't need a reason why they're just evil. They're just evil. They want to, you know, kill babies and have slaves, and they want to go to war, and they just want to corrupt things. That's what they want to do. That's just all they know how to do. Genetically, it's like embedded in them. And I found, in wrestling through a lot of the literature on Khazarian Mafia thesis, that it's very unsatisfying. Like I see a lot of broad statements and claims that are made characterizing these orcs and evil demonic forces of this Jewish Khazarian kingdom. And it's an anomaly. Like, why did this kingdom? It was a Turkic kingdom. They converted under King Bulan, as the story goes, to Judaism, as at least the official court religion. It's not like everybody had to be Jewish, but that was like the official court religion. of the immediate aristocracy. Why did they do that? What was the story? What was the geopolitical environment in which it occurred? Because these guys will say, okay, it was just evil, and after that, the Khazarians, they tried to scrub data of their existence after the 10th century. Then they became the Rothschilds. Then they took over Venice. Then they took over England. Then they took over everything, and they're just everywhere because they want to. And you can like impose a motive onto that if you want. You know, they just want to destroy the goyim. They're the chosen people. They want to destroy the goyim. They say, you know, and that's it. That's their motive, total domination. Because that's so. But in looking at the proofs, I'm a researcher. I'm looking for like, where's your evidence? You're going to make a generalization. You're going to make a judgment call. Back it up. And I very rarely found that satisfying. Like, okay, well, where's your citation? Where's your evidence to back up this statement or that statement? So it's a lot of generalizations, kind of like office gossip. That paints over the existence of the Venetian Empire. It doesn't even exist in that world. The continuity of the Roman families into Venice and into, that's not even there. It's like, if anything, these are victims of this evil Jewish thing. And so, you know, I started looking into it a little bit more with a scrutinizing eye. The research of one particular figure was very helpful to me, named Pierre Baudry, who is also the co-author or the author of the first book in my Canadian history series. Mm-hmm. He did a lot of work on this, and I used a lot of the research, a lot of the leads, a lot of the books that he was pointing out, to just look at the evidence. Whatever is available, I tried looking at, and I found a very different picture. So when you actually start looking at what were contemporaries who lived in the time of Khazaria and Charlemagne, there were people who lived there and wrote, who spoke about this kingdom. What were they saying about it? What were the geopolitical environments and fights that were going on, right? Mm-hmm. And does this mafia thesis conform with that, or does it disrupt that? It disrupts the Khazarian Mafia thesis, because what you have is something. Okay, well, here's the thing. It wasn't purely a monolithic Jewish thing. There was this Turkic grouping, this Turkic kingdom that settled in that region. All scholars agree that looking at the remnants of whatever literature and secondary evidence, is that it was a very Confucian. They had a Confucian principle embedded in their worldview even before they converted. Very much based on the mandate of heaven. That idea was like central in that Turkic philosophical worldview. They also, once they did choose at a certain point to convert, and keep in mind, there's always efforts to get religious wars going at that time. When they did choose to convert, they had a very ecumenical thing going there too, where they chose not to have a Jewish military of Khazaria. This is around 750, 760 AD. What they did is they had an agreement with the Abbasid dynasty, who supplied a 12 or 13,000 man army to live in Khazaria as a sitting Muslim army that would then defend Khazaria under the condition that any war or any attacker that came on and attacked Khazaria, the Muslims would then defend, except if Khazaria by any reason in the future would ever declare war in the Muslim world. At that point, they would attack Khazaria. So it was a really brilliant strategic safeguard. Just imagine the state of Israel today having an agreement with the Arab world to say, okay, you'll be our army, you protect us, unless we go to war with one of your countries, then you could attack us. Like, that's quite the interesting creative solution to a lot of problems. Judicially, it's also interesting that like the Supreme Court, kind of like the Areopagus of Khazaria, which discerned all laws. The application of laws was not a Jewish monolith either. It was 2 Jews would be the judges, 2 Christians, 2 Muslims, and 1 Greek, one pagan from the, because paganism of the Greek time was still very active. That would be the configuration of the Supreme Court. On top of that, there were these interesting anomalies too, where like Charlemagne had an agreement where I believe it was one of his daughters he agreed to marry as a Christian Augustinian kingdom, right? Agreed. There was a Jewish kingdom in the south of Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire called Narbonne in today's southern France. And he basically made this a Jewish kingdom with a Jewish king and a Christian wife of one of his daughters. And he got he basically had an agreement that this It was a diplomatic agreement reached between diplomats from Khazaria, from Harun al-Rashid, because there was a vibrant Jewish community still in Baghdad that had the lineage of David as well maintained, as the story goes. And anyhow, one of the figures, one of the leading members of one of those families was brought in from Baghdad to settle in Narbonne, to become the king of Narbonne, married to the daughter of Charlemagne, and they established a really great, again, ecumenical type of diplomatic maneuver, which was all premised on the idea that we're all human, first and foremost. We all have common interests together. And that, again, force of stability, this is all, I think one of the reasons why this has been so scrubbed from our history is because it disproves so concretely such theses like that of Samuel P. Huntington or Bernard Lewis, who are at the heart of today's New World Order ideology of a clash of civilizations, that human beings are not able to maintain peace ourselves. We need, because we will always, if you let human beings be themselves, they will always go to war, we are told. Christians will always fight Muslims, will always fight Confucians, will always fight Buddhists, will always fight Hindus, will always fight everything, you know? In a world of each against all to the death, unless the solution becomes, if you think that way, the only solution to peace, if we want to still believe in peace, is a Leviathan above the system to impose and maintain order from the top. And this is essentially the old Roman Empire's idea of, you know, having one unipolar ring to rule them all, so-called, you know. So this proves that that actually is not true. And in fact, when you let it's like babies, you know, like look at children. When you put them in a daycare together, they don't care about skin color or anything like that. They'll just play together. That's human beings. And so it's the same thing when you have mature human beings who are given access to their full emotional development and empathy properly with their reason, their ability to recognize evil. Like Jesus said, you know, like you should strive to be as wise as serpents and soft as doves. That's masterful. Like, yeah, you have to always have that childlike innocence to be soft and loving, but at the same time, don't be intellectually stupid about evil. Evil exists. It's sophisticated and it's bloodthirsty, and you don't want to just like trust everybody equally. You know, you want to look for the good in everything. But that's the thing. We will tend to organize in harmony with each other, and avoid the trappings of empire or wars.
Yeah, we say that we got to be cosmic intelligence assets.
I like that. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah, the instruments of God. And yeah, that's totally.
Hey, Matt, when Charlemagne set up that Jewish guy, the Jewish king in Narbonne, which I do believe, if I recall, was like a port town as well. Yeah. So obviously, that's an interesting move when you think about it, because the Venetians aren't too far away from as they did that. So obviously they knew that he set up that Jewish guy over there, right?
Most certainly. Yeah, they wanted, like, there was a vying for control over commerce, right? And the Venetians always had they were always drooling over controlling that as one of the key nodes of maritime commerce at the time. Right. So yeah, that was a big fight. This thing endured for about a century of vibrant creative development, and things started going awry, I would say. Charlemagne's son continued the good policy as much as he could. His grandsons, though, were more of a disaster, and they were more bigoted, or at least more into their own little mini self-interest. They lost the spirit of their father and grandfather, and they fell into a trap that was organized by a lot of Venetian backdoor diplomacy, which had also had a lot of penetration into the Catholic Church of the Vatican at the time, or of Rome at the time, which, you know, just like everything, there's a deep state everywhere. There's fifth columns everywhere, and you'll find examples of good humanists who love humankind in positions of power at various times within the Vatican, within Rome. And at other times, you'll find the satanic parasite masquerading as a pseudo-Christian cult, but actually up to no good, subverting the good from within. You'll find that everywhere. Yeah. So this was something which, due to some backdoor diplomacy, the kids were induced to carve up their father's kingdom. That was the only time Europe was ever unified as one giant force after the Roman Empire. And after that, one kid took the East. There was something called the Oath of Strasbourg. And, you know, one grandson basically carved up the eastern zone. Another grandson carved up the middle, called Lotharingia. His name was Lothar. And there was another kid whose name I'm forgetting on the west of Europe, who carved that up into sort of 3 factions, and then there was a smaller 4th faction. And 2 of the grandsons were induced to sign the Oath of Strasbourg in around 1890 or so. Sorry, not 890 or so.
890.
Might have been a bit earlier, which basically had the 2 kids on either side agree to gang up on the kid in the middle on Lotharingia and have like this. These are the types of military alliances that are self-destructive. They always said that's what got us into World War I. That's what's getting us into World War III. It's, like we'll all, no matter what, whether a war that ever should come in the future is just or unjust, we'll back you up anyway. Collective security, act in NATO. That's the thing. So that's what ended up happening. And anybody who wants to know like how these different cultural divisions and even borders of Europe were formed, like why is Germany or France, why do they have the borders today that they do?
Yeah.
Or Spain, well, Spain is more obvious, but any of the countries of Europe, like why? You can't understand that if you don't look at the breakup of Charlemagne's kingdom back then, that it then began to induce religious wars, like the creation of the Holy Roman Empire came out of that. There was one attempt to try to unify it once more in the 10th century, but that didn't really work out in a sustained way. I think it was King Otto the First, who was trying to revive that Charlemagne unifying principle, but that was subverted. And then coming out of that, everything kind of started really falling apart. The Silk Road fell into disarray around the 9th century. This is when the Tang Dynasty collapsed. Luckily, you had some wise leaders who were able to revive the best elements culturally, at least, of the Tang Dynasty of Confucianism, and that became the early Song Dynasty. And then you had the late Song Dynasty, and that was overall still a period of rich, vibrant creative discoveries and artistic advances. But the Silk Road had disappeared for the most part, or at least it had been dismantled by a factor of 90% or more, because the Muslim world went into more disarray. The Christian world went into disarray. The world around, we don't fully know the story of what happened to Khazaria, but by that time it was getting carved up and going to hell fast. There were laws that were passed by around 980. Mm-hmm. Strange laws that began to be passed, all targeting the Jews. So like it became illegal in Venice to do business with any ship that had a Jew on it. Jews were forbidden from being members of guilds or trade schools or having any trade beyond simply being sellers of, they were allowed to be sellers of used cloth in Venice, or they were allowed to do accounting and banking. That was the 2 points where you were allowed.
Which I found so interesting when I don't remember, was one of your lectures where you said that, and I was like, well, that's where it started, like the stereotype of like Jews only being in banking and this. It's like all the way back to Venetian times where they were forced into only certain positions. Like,
and it was replicated in Germany, it was replicated in England. The same policy of forbidding Jews from having access to various crafts, no farming, they couldn't be soldiers, they weren't allowed to carry a weapon, they couldn't do anything. And it was a real cultural apartheid imposed. And the Jewish kingdom of Khazaria, like I said, it was really dismantled. And to the point that I've never seen such an obsessive amount of erasing, of burning of literature. There's hardly much left that a lot of scholars can work with. You have, like I said, some Muslim historians and geographers who spoke very well of this kingdom. They did happen to have, apparently, and I think this is probably true, there was the practice of the slave markets. That was something that was there, and I think that Khazaria possibly was involved in that. But I think, and that's one of the reasons that people will say, oh, look, it's this evil, Mordor society, they were doing slavery. And it's like, yeah, but look at the age that they lived in. Like the Muslim world was doing like the slave markets, like the Christian world had slave markets. It's not like anybody didn't have, like, that was a big part of the world. It's like today, criticizing, one country for using slave labor, cheap labor for dollaramas. And it's like, or, like, okay, but did they make the policy? Like, I don't like using slave labor for my dollaramas, but like, is everybody equally complicit, or where did this come from?
Right.
All that to say, there was a consistent destruction. Only today, recently, there was some scrolls that were discovered in Egypt, forgetting the name, thousands and thousands, a whole attic in this old ancient 14,000-year-old monastery in Egypt that has been uncovered. Oh man, I hate forgetting. Anyway, it'll come later. But there are references to Khazaria that have survived, that are being now fleshed out and looked through, and it's very interesting. Positive things, you know, but overall it's been scrubbed. And so coming out of that, the Venetians that were at this point, what were they doing? First crusade had been orchestrated and bankrolled in the early 11th century against the Christian versus Muslim world. There were 4 of these major crusades that turned the Christian world into a basket case of just like economics became about like, what do you steal, not about what you create anymore. And the inter-civilizational disharmony really got amplified. And one of the things that Venice was, it was a bit of a evil genius coup d'etat against the Ottomans, because keep in mind, not the Ottomans, sorry, against the Eastern Orthodox Church, which at that time was like the last bastion of the Roman Empire, was still the East in Constantinople. And they had largely, Constantinople had dominant sea control, especially with commerce into Asia, and sea control over much of the Mediterranean. Venice wanted that power. They were still located in the sort of armpit of Italy, you know, and they wanted all of those maritime zones,
trade routes.
And so how did they get them? They did get them. How did they get them? So they got them through the Fourth Crusade. And the Fourth Crusade, you know, people look at Venice today and they're a little surprised by the architecture and the art in St. Mark's Square and other things. And you're like, this is very Byzantine artwork everywhere in Venice. Like, where did this artwork come from? And basically, it goes back to the Fourth Crusade, where they got a bunch of idiotic Christian mercenaries to go to war, but they didn't have enough money. Everybody was indebted to Venice. And so they didn't have the means to get their like 20,000 or whatever it was troops, their soldiers, into the boats, into the Holy Land to go and fight the Ottomans and the pagan, or not the pagan, but the infidels, the Muslim infidels. So how do they do it? Or how do they get the money? Well, Venice basically had a great idea. They said, well, okay, you got to pay us the money you owe us to use our boats, because we control all the boats at this point in that area you need to use. So why don't you just go and fight this little kingdom here in Constantinople? Just
so wicked.
Just go sack Constantinople, take their money. They're bad people.
Sack that over there.
Yeah, trust us, they're bad. And sure enough, these Christian soldiers stupidly went and declared war. They besieged and destroyed Constantinople, killed tens of thousands of Christians. So it's Christians killing Christians. They sacked it, stole everything, burnt big chunks of the library that had the ancient manuscripts, and sent the bounty to Venice. Much of it went to Venice. And they got the money that then was used to pay for the boats. But instead of paying for the boats, they were like carrying so much loot and booty that they were like, well, let's just go home. So they never even made it to the Holy Land. They just like went back home with their money and gave Venice like 50%. And Venice, coming out of that, got control of all of the Byzantine shipping lanes. They basically, within 1 year, took control of all of that. So now this little messed up city-state, which was called the Serene Republic, that was what Venice called itself, was a republic. And it wasn't a republic. It was a total oligarchy. And Shakespeare
just destroyed them.
Renders this thing transparent in his plays, in Othello and The Merchant of Venice. This is a thing that was run by a doge, just to get a sense of how insane this self-controlling structure worked. You had sort of the doge at the top, who is somebody from one of the accepted families. You had a committee of 3 controlling the doge, and the committee of 3 controlled also all of this. It was a police state, so everybody was paid money to tell on their neighbors if there was anything suspicious. So obviously, you had a lot of people making money delivering even false intel to the city lions. So you had these these monuments with these lion faces with their mouths open that anybody could drop like accusations into, and it would be dealt with by the committee of 3. So they had like full control of the secret police. I mean, and something like 1 person in 20 was a member of the secret police of Venice. Everyone was self-censoring, afraid that they would be overheard saying the wrong thing or criticizing the wrong person. The poverty level was huge, and it was also a festival level, like the Carnival, the Venetian masks that people you see it being used in things like Eyes Wide Shut with the last Stanley Kubrick movie.
Right.
That's a take on the Venetian Carnival system of orgies. Right. People would just hide their identities and just get off on each other for on a regular basis. It was part of just the culture. Very hedonistic. And
hey, actually your wife Cynthia, she did that brilliant lecture on the Bravo in this period. Yeah. And man, when you read that novel, The Bravo, I mean, it's so dark when they go into where the Doge is and where these guys hang out. Like, I mean, cinematically, if you would portray it, man, it would just be so dark. You'd have to find like other ways to lighten up the movie, for it not
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know how that would work.
She just killed it when she did that. We'll put it out there, everybody. Go back and watch that lecture by Cynthia, because Matt's doing a wonderful job giving us the overview, but she'd spend 2 hours just destroying it.
Yeah, she laid it out. Yeah. If you guys could put the link, I'll send the link to her class.
Yeah, for sure.
It was so
Matt,
good.
I'm really curious though, before you move forward, that whatever happened to the Jewish king that Charlemagne set up, which was right in that zone? Like, what did they do with Narbonne in that area? When did the Venetians take that over, or did they, or what happened?
That's a question I still have to answer. I don't fully have the story on that. I'm sure we could get that pretty easily, though. It's just not something I had the time to really delve into, but I'm sure we can get that story relatively easily.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm just curious. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. But definitely,
we could move forward to Manifest Destiny. I mean, we're having such a fun time.
Let's migrate there, but let's do it.
There you go.
I'll try to transition in a lawful way.
Yeah,
so
go for it.
The thing became here, this parasitical hive then basically found itself, its center of command was Venice. It's one of the problems in the Christian faith for these I would call them satanic bloodlines and satanic cult priests of this weird thing, was that in the Christian faith is not very favorable to the utilization of usury, just like the Muslim world it's more extremely visceral in the Quran, but it's also there in the Bible. Like, usury is not acceptable. Right. So the problem was, how do you maintain the aura or the image of being Christian while at the same time needing to do usury as a part of the necessary tool basket of an empire committing economic warfare against its enemies? So this is where the phenomenon of the Hofjuden, the court banker, comes in as a new variable in the great game. So a lot of these early Jewish families, like in the Jewish faith, there's nowhere explicitly stated in the Talmud or the Quran or the Torah or the Jewish Bible that you cannot do the usury. So they would then utilize these court or the various selected Jewish families as mercenaries, economic hitmen, to carry out dirty work, but always on behalf of a higher master race, a higher master class above them. And because they were doing the dirty work, and the more sociopathic, the ones who were the best at doing what they were assigned to do, were granted family privileges. So their kids were promised and their grandkids were promised a certain little mini dynasty license or something, to be protected, to have certain privileges granted as long as they keep up and maintain the family tradition. So to the degree that they do that, guaranteed. And so another form of like bad cultural dynamic was sort of set into motion inside of the Jewish cultural matrix that undermined a lot of the better humanistic traditions that were also very vibrant and good in the Jewish cultural matrix. So, the more you reward over generations a certain type of bad behavior, and the more you punish good behavior, you make it impossible for people to have trades or any type of, actual meaningful work and participation in a community, you're going to bring out the worst in people. And so the Jews started getting a bad rap. And this is where Shakespeare's polemicizing against this with the character of Shylock in The Merchant of Venice. Now, Shakespeare is often accused of being an anti-Semitic or, an anti-Jewish guy. Did he believe the Christian faith to be superior? Yeah, he believed that. That's why he has Shylock being forced to convert at the end, against his will to Christianity. Now, at the same time, did he believe that all Jewish, was he anti-Jewish? No, because Shylock wasn't the only Jew in the play. Shylock had a daughter. He had a friend. Now, the daughter also did convert on her will. She was horrified by her father's evil, but his friend never converted. His friend was horrified as a Jew who was horrified by the immorality of Shylock, who wanted a pound of flesh from, the merchant, who got indebted and was being expected to honor a debt even at the price of death. And it's like, can you measure money and life on the same scales? That was the test, right? And that's the whole lesson of the play. Yeah. So the other Jewish associate of Shylock is horrified at this guy's disgusting immorality. And so the point that Shakespeare is getting at is not that Jews are like Shylock, it's that Shylock is a bad person. That's his problem. And he happens to be a Jew. And there's a cultural problem there in terms of the utilization of Jewish bankers and how they're obsessed with usury and debt over and contractual law over human law, like natural law. That was a blurry problem for a lot of people. But it wasn't the Jewish thing that was the cause of that. So anyway, this is where things like the Montefiore family ends up becoming one of the early, dynastic mercenaries. Later on, the Rothschilds are brought in the mid to late 18th century, a little before the American Revolution, as kind of a coin dealer, Amschel Rothschild, who had some skill and some sociopathy and was thus granted more rights and privilege. So there's a lot of these things that were brought in. Now, people, again, will tend to look at the past through the filter of their present biases. And they're like, okay, the Rothschilds are this super powerful family. Thus, they look at the past from the vantage point that they've always been. And they can't see that there's a glass ceiling that even the Rothschilds and all of these other coterie mercenary bankers are not allowed to marry up into. They're not allowed to pollute higher bloodlines.
Right.
And that's provable. That's actually a demonstrable thing. So they're kept and used as a hate. The way I think of it is like what do you call it? A well of hate, a hate absorber. That's it. So obviously, when you're doing the dirty work, people will obviously hate who's hurting them. Right. It will be harder to see who's controlling their user. So it's useful to have these characters like George Soros, or like name a bad guy who people tend to hate today, who does a lot of bad, and they forget that there's this higher function. Right. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing, and this gets us into this manifest destiny thing. So, okay, the period when Venice had to move, this is how I'll work it in. The period that Venice had to migrate from Venice, or the oligarchy had to migrate their functions geopolitically from Venice in the armpit of Italy to a new location more strategic to their interests, which became first the Amsterdam area, and then very quickly thereafter it became the British Isles on the island. Okay. This was their wake-up call was, I'm going to talk about this in my class, so it's good practice here for me. I'm going to do this on Sunday. Nice. Was something called the League of Cambrai of 1508 that was organized, where all of the different leaders of Europe representing different localized interests. The French were fighting the English for hundreds of years in the 100 Years of War. Then the English were fighting themselves in the War of the Roses. And then, you had the Holy Roman Empire, which was this hyper divided empire of baronials and princelings under the control of the Holy Roman Emperor, who himself was beholden to the Vatican. And then you had, the Habsburg and the Spanish Empire, and everybody was fighting each other. Constant divide to conquer, all being funded by Venice, the Venetian bankers that had, again, control of the bullion, control of everything. Also, intelligence, as they controlled the shipping, they also controlled the postal services. So any type of international communications passed through Venice. So a lot of forgeries, a lot of reading people's intel. And that's how they had this great high capacity for profiling and providing intel at a very quick speed around almost real time, which is a miracle for the age before electricity, right? Amazing. Also, they had the monopoly of trade into Mongolia, like under the Khans, Genghis Khan, the one Western power that was allowed to operate freely in trade in all of Genghis Khan and his heirs, all territories that were being taken over under this new global cognate was Venice. Why? Why did they do that to Venice? Was it possible that Venice was providing these barbaric groups?
I know we were just told that they were just, barbarians and Mongols and like this, like, how did they, it's so infiltrated in everything. It's just,
exactly. Like Marco Polo and his dad were like the advisors to Kublai Khan, like that's Marco Polo is not just this objective explorer wanting to like check out Asia. No, he had like political assignments. He was advising the Khans. And what was he advising them on? What intel was he providing them in terms of the weaknesses of the courts of that Khan was that he was getting into, that he was destroying one after the other? So you had this whole thing, right? It wasn't just a European phenomena. And so back to the story, League of Cambrai. This was a moment where the various leaders of the humanist faction, I would say they were all Augustinian, the Augustinian current within Christianity, which was like the Platonic current that had probably the greatest epistemological handle on things, were able to orchestrate a series of diplomatic exchanges where these different kingdoms were induced to finally talk with each other for once. And realize, like, why are we all fighting each other when the same people are the Venetians who are benefiting off of all of our wars? Why don't we just actually like just destroy Venice and start working together? And they did. And so that League of Cambrai, which, I mean, one of the key architects of it was Machiavelli, who worked very closely with Leonardo da Vinci in the defense of Florence. Machiavelli is often given a bad rap for being a That's why the word Machiavellian is not usually a compliment.
It's not usually positive.
No. But Machiavelli was into realpolitik too, and he never wanted, first of all, his prince, which is what he's probably the most well known for, to ever be published for public consumption. He made that very specific to a one specific prince in Florence and Milan that needed to understand the nature of evil in the real world while you're at war. And there were, satanic. He was a realist in that sense, but he was also like, when you read his books on Livy. That's lesser known, but like these are the things he wanted to be his posterity. This is where you get a sense of the sublime, loving, divine character that was in his heart. And this is, Da Vinci was a very close ally, and Caesar Borgia, who was a big backer of a lot of this. So it was basically League of Cambrai involved the Vatican, Pope Julius II, who was a corrupt pope who screws things up later on. He ends up becoming a key part of organizing the Holy Roman Empire to join. France is the key figure or the key area that was behind this, along with Florence and Milan. Everybody joins and they destroy the Venetian mercantile fleet. The whole thing is wiped off the map. And just as they're about to go in for their second thrust, like Machiavelli writes, like Venice just lost in one day what it took them 800 years to gain. Everybody was celebrating that finally a new age of harmony and peace with a post-oligarchical era was upon us. And the Venetians were able to pull some very nasty, brilliantly evil maneuvers that involved.
What time period are we in? Sorry, just
509 now.
Okay.
Sorry, 1509.
1509.
I was like, okay, 15.
Yeah, sorry, 1509. So the first onslaught was the early part of 1509. Whole Venetian fleets were wiped out. Just before the second axe could come down on Venice, that's where all of a sudden this is weird. All of a sudden, Pope Julius pulls himself and the Holy Roman Empire of what's Germany today out of the alliance. Not only do they pull it out, he accepts a bribe by Venice, and Venice basically agrees to pay something like 2 or 3 times more than market value for all of the alum properties that the Vatican has control of. Alum is a very high value commodity back in those days for glass and other things. And a few other things. They also agree to give the Vatican a whole bunch of properties that they had control over. And so that bribe works. Julius II does what he does. And all of a sudden they create a new alliance that soon involves Henry VIII, join it very, very soon thereafter. Everybody is now working with Venice. So the new alliance is everybody with Venice as Honest Iago, as our new Venetian honest Venice. And everybody goes to war with France, Florence, and Milan. And France and Florence are all of a sudden left like all of their allies are attacking them. They're like, what are you doing? And they battle it out. Da Vinci avoids assassination by first escaping to Rome and then going to France under King Louis the 12th, who provides him security where he lives out the rest of his days. Machiavelli and Caesar Borgia's citizen army, that was one of the keys to their success in the battles against Venice, was having this not mercenaries, but really like trained citizen soldiers. That's wiped out. They're all massacred. So that undermines this entire like new model of military strategy. And so Venice survives to be evil another day. Now, the thing, though, is it's a wake-up call for the Venetian grand strategists, because they realize that they're a lot weaker than they thought they were, and they're more vulnerable. So they're trying to figure out, well, how do we get to a more secure strategic location? And this is where there's this big discussion in the highest echelons. Cynthia actually did another great class on this, on the Ghost Seer by Schiller a couple of years ago. It's a really good lesson where she goes through this in more depth. But essentially they focus on then moving their operations to smother a phenomenon that had awoken in the 15th century Golden Renaissance. So Florence was the center of a new, they'd basically just begun rediscovering the ancient ideas of Plato, of the ancient sciences of Thales and others. The Pythagorean method was making a comeback, but it was being deployed in a economic program, which was in many ways unleashed by Dante Alighieri, centered around the construction of a project in Florence that started in around 1260, 1270, but it took a while for this project to really start to complete itself. And it was the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral, this gigantic dome. Wow. And it was basically a multi-generational, like kind of like a pyramid building project. It took about 200 years for this thing to be finished, and it involved doing things, making discoveries of impossibilities. To this very day, it's the largest stone dome in existence. We haven't been able to replicate how they did that. Even today, with all our technology, we can't figure it out. Now, this was done because it was understood that you have to give people an impossible challenge to awaken the best of what's inside of them, right? Yeah. You can't do what already exists. And so the person to really make the discovery of how to solve the problem of the dome was Filippo Brunelleschi, Brunelleschi. And he put into motion a design which worked. And it disobeyed all of the naive mathematical formulas of the day that didn't work. Every time you just tried to build a dome using a half circle or even an oval, it would fall in on itself before you get very high. He was able to get across the solution in ways that I fully haven't been able to wrap my mind around. I don't think anybody really has fully answered it. But it used certain understandings of physical geometries. Anyway, yeah, that's a whole class, which in fact, now that I'm talking about it, back in 2016, Cynthia Chung gave a class on this in 2016 that I totally forgot about. Yeah, brilliant stuff. Anyway, so this became a new cultural basis around which Da Vinci was trained. So Da Vinci was brought into the mission project, this science driver project that was creating new inventions, new machinery, things that were thousands of new designs were coming online, that he was participating in. That was like an educational process with hundreds of thousands of people over the generations processed through that, and then who went back with new skills into their different parts of Italy. This is the heart of the Golden Renaissance. And so just like we had earlier Renaissances, this was, again, breakthroughs in medicine and astronomy and in statecraft and everything. And the idea of the new idea that human beings are not just a creature of adaptation that would adapt to our fixed conditions, right, but rather we are a creature of creative leaps, that we can always transcend our limits to growth by going outside of our limits within ourselves, by also going outside of the objective limits in the world we live in and making new discoveries, right? That liberates us from the previous constraints. Yeah. That was a wonderful idea that gave rise to a new school of economic science called cameralism, which also grew out of Italy, and it quickly leapt into France and Germany and England, people like Thomas More was an early cameralist. So was Erasmus. More, who got his head cut off for trying to like stop the the splintering up of the church even more, when he didn't want to give consent to the idea that Henry VIII should be the basis or the head of a new church, because he wants to get laid. And so cameralism was the idea that, okay, there's a relationship between it's kind of like the mandate of heaven, right? That a king is only a just king when he's not a master of the people, but a servant of the people, that he's a servant of God's will, and thus is like a father and a servant, to be responsible for the growth of mature citizens who could become fully actualized as in terms of, being made in the image of God, which means you have to sponsor uplifting cultural processes, right? You have to provide orphans the means to read, and you have to give people work like internal improvements, and also you have to go to beyond your limits in terms of things like the New World were beginning to open up. It wasn't always like, a lot of the critical race theory stuff of our current day has us treat everything in the past that were done by dead white European males as all equally bad. And it's like, yeah, dead white European males did a lot of bad, but at the same time, you'll find also dead white European males who did a lot of good, and it's mixed. So I think Columbus is consciously given a bad rap as being like this evil exploiter baron of the natives of the Americas. And I think that that's wrong. When you actually look at the writings and the intentions explicitly stated by Columbus, and look at his acts that he did in his 4 voyages, including when he was put in prison by his enemies back in Europe, in Portugal, after the 4th voyage, you could see that he represented something very positive, and it was this entire deep state oligarchic apparatus that undermined the idea of creating a new type of society in the New World based upon a respect for the divinity of all human beings, regardless of whether you're a Christian or not. Then like massacres and destruction occurred in the wake of that Spanish imperial, Portuguese imperial policy. We don't have to say more about that because everyone knows about the horrors of that stuff. Sure. But all that to say, it's mixed. And this whole idea of the New World awoke new intellectual vistas. This gets us at Manifest Destiny, right?
Yeah.
So where did this idea of American or the positive element of American Manifest Destiny arise? It was from this period where there was a concept now that we're not just in this localized little part of the world where if you venture too far, most of the masses believed you'd fall off the side of the world into an abyss. And there was, look at all the maps before the Renaissance of the oceans, and you'll always find sea monsters, other things that will kill you. So more reason to just stay on land like a good little plebe, or a good little sheep on your plantation, and know your role. That was the ethic, know your role. So in the new ethic, with this idea that there's this other civilization of human beings on the other side of the ocean in another land, it opened up new possibilities. And a lot of the humanists around More, that's why More was writing the Utopia when he did. It was to give the intelligentsia of Europe, as well as the people, an idea that, okay, he was both criticizing the absurdity and hypocrisy of his own, oligarchical system. Like, he has his character going in and criticizing, like, why are we in, here in England, we're killing people with the death penalty for stealing money as well as killing somebody. Whether you kill or whether you steal, you still get the death penalty. That's a bit much, isn't it? Can you weigh, again, a human life and money on the same scale of justice? And and he makes a point even that one of the characters in his Platonic dialogue in the Utopia makes a point. Well, if anything, this is actually just causing more murders, because it's if the thief knows that he's gonna die by getting caught either way, his chance of getting caught are less if he just kills the witness, right, that he's robbing. Whereas otherwise he might have just let the witness live because it's going to be death either way, right? Yeah. And he's like, but look at Utopia, they don't do it there. And he's like talking about this character who just voyaged and lives with the Utopians in South America for like 5 years, and he's like, and just going through this like imaginary world of justice. He also throws in some absurdities as well to get people like critically thinking a little bit, about like, oh yeah, they don't even have property and all this stuff. But it's really a thought experiment, an exercise. Holding up one model that never existed and just now using that as an ability to contrast all of the norms that are actually totally unnatural in the world you're living in. So you got this going on. the entire humanist process ends up ultimately dying out, though, as the Venetian plague and parasite ends up taking control. The Rosicrucian order is taken increasing implants itself into the hierarchies of Europe, starting, or especially of England, starting with Henry VIII. And then Robert the Flood and John Dee are these other intelligence agents who are really satanic, bringing in more virulent forms of Rosicrucianism, hyper mysticism that breaks up the mystical and the divine from the reasonable. So basically, these are people who are saying, because like the great scientists are also men and women of faith as well. You know, I shouldn't say women, because at the time back then women weren't given the opportunity to activate that so much. That came later, but the idea was that, yeah, like we have to have faith that guides our reason, but the Rosicrucian and these other Masonic, you know, mystery orders that also had a certain Kabbalistic twist at a certain point, which is effectively a Babylonian technique of inducing self-hypnotic trances using like random syllabic blah blah blah, you know, chanting and putting yourself into a chant with aromas and candles and, yeah, basically ways of driving yourself, deconstructing yourself, that all are part of this initiation process. These things were all coming out of Venice. That's why Venice was also the key printing press area for a long time. And they were publishing a lot of these mystical works. So John Dee, again, Robert Flood, others, they were trying to like bring human beings into this idea of an irrational deity with an order that didn't care about our personal ability to influence it for better or for worse. So there's just this predestination idea, and maybe you could read tea leaves, you could have like some sort of, you know,
that's when it started.
Yeah. And so there was this takeover of, first, again, England, and England was fully taken over. I would say in my research, it really occurred around the time of the Glorious Revolution, they call it, of 1688.
80s.
Which saw, you know, a Dutch king implanted as a puppet king into England from Amsterdam. But the Venetians had already taken over Amsterdam by that time. They had created the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609 as the world's second sort of private central bank. The Bank of England later on, after the Glorious Revolution, became the second private central bank on that model of an independent bank that would control national monetary policy. It's self-modeled earlier on the Bank of Venice and the Levant Company. So even somebody like, just to get a sense of this, Benjamin Disraeli, who was later on a prime minister of Britain for a period, he even wrote a book where he talks about how William of Orange and George the First, George the Second, George the Third, he describes how these were all effectively doges. And how George III, he says, you know, didn't want to be a doge. He's the only one who tried to resist, but he couldn't escape his Venetian constitution. And Disraeli is very candid. He's not against it necessarily, but he's candid about what it is. And he talks about how it's the Venetian party of Lord Marlborough, who was John Churchill, the great grandpa of Winston. Who is the head of the Venetian party, and he's like the key mercenary of the British Empire, who brings in this coup d'état and purges England of all of its Augustinian, Erasmian, Thomas More currents, who had been still people like Jonathan Swift, who was an advisor to the Prime Minister Robert Harley, another great man, who were trying to organize voyages to the New World to set up things like the Jamestown colony in 1605 as the first British colony. Ultimately, that went to hell. That was undermined and sabotaged. But the overarching desire was, again, to reawaken this policy of getting far enough away from the corruption and the rot that had so been deeply ingrained in the old world, and create a space, a cultural space where the good couldn't be subverted so easily.
Right.
And that's what even, you know, I think that there's a good study I even read of Shakespeare's The Tempest, written around the same period in 1608 or 1609. And Shakespeare's relationship to the same networks that were Walter Raleigh was a part of, the great explorer and voyager, who was the one pushing these colonization projects in the Americas. So you have this rich potential to continue and reawaken the better Renaissance traditions. it's ultimately subverted. The Bank of England takes hold. Robert Harley, after the death of Queen Anne, Robert Harley is stuck in the Tower of London for several years by his enemies. Jonathan Swift, his advisor, basically escapes assassination and goes to Ireland, where it's slightly safer, to try to fight another day. And all of these guys, keep in mind here, they're all in constant correspondence later on, especially after the 16, here we're talking here, the 1630s, 40s.
Oh,
They're the ones who are behind the early landing of the Mayflower colony. So people like John Winthrop, the Mathers, the whole family, they're constantly in dialogue with people like Jonathan Swift, like Gottfried Leibniz, the great scientist statesman who almost became prime minister under Queen Anne of England. Actually, Sophia, who was supposed to be the heir to Queen Anne, who was his student. Gottfried Leibniz was a really, really strong Platonic, like this guy was just on another level of brilliance, like a Da Vinci of his time. And he, again, almost had his prodigy, his student Sophia, who was an older woman, become the queen after Anne died. But Sophia died a little bit too soon by mysterious circumstances. Then Anne died, and then a Hellfire Club inductee named George I of Hanover becomes the king, and he hates Leibniz, cuts off Leibniz from all of his funding. He's, again, a Hellfire prodigy, and empowers things like the South Sea Bubble. So the whole, anything good that was done by Harley and Swift in England, like the creation of a national land bank, which they tried to do to subvert or break away from the Bank of England. They created a national land bank to fund internal works, internal improvements. That was part of the Cameralist project. That became then subverted and taken over to become it became the South Sea Company. That's the famous South Sea Bubble that exploded in a speculative collapse in 1720. That was the land bank originally. So it was undermined. And Britain went through a huge economic turmoil at that point, but the Hellfire Club networks consolidated their power. So in America, that's where you have this very interesting fight with, I got a book here by a really great scholar. Here, I only get it. It's a great book called How the Nation Was Won by Graham Lowry. America's Untold Story from 1630 to 1759.
Okay.
It was volume 1 of 2. Unfortunately, the author died before he could finish volume 2, so we only get volume 1. But it's a really great story, going through everything I've just said in such thorough detail, and it reads like a drama, would make a wonderful documentary or movie. But these are the groups that were organizing to create, like John Winthrop stated when he founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, was a city on a hill. A new type of order was being created, founded upon the idea of all men being created equal, made in the eyes of God and in the image of God, and capable thus, and even mandated to participate in the unfolding of creation. So God isn't seen in that paradigm as this tyrannical overlord, overbearing on you, expecting you to be good, well behaved.
Right.
That's actually an evil oligarch who's imposing his image onto God. God, in their view, is actually, that we're made in the image of, is a creative, loving force that's constantly creative, that is everywhere, right? And it everywhere creative, not passive. So in that sense, you have to do good, and that's where the idea of a self-perfectibility of government that has to build itself not around some crystallized finished state, but in something which is open enough, like the American founding documents. They're the definition of self-perfecting documents. They're open to being made better, and it's built in order to form a more perfect union. They're not even saying to form a perfect union, we're going to do this. No, that's ignorant. They knew it. They're like, okay, this is going to be better qualitatively than what came before, but it's not the best. It can be made better implicitly, right? Which is why you're allowed to amend the Constitution according to reason and discourse in an educated citizenry. That doesn't work if the citizenry becomes dumbed down, abused, like psychologically and emotionally kept infantile. Then you don't. That doesn't work anymore.
Exactly.
then democracy is just a tool of the oligarchy to get the mob to do what it wants, right? So the whole idea of a democratic republic, it's not a democracy, it's a democratic republic, as Ben Franklin said when he's asked, like, what did you create? And that idea is, it's cultural. You always have to have the culture leading the progress. They have to go together. But sometimes the progress can sometimes lead the culture, but it can't fall too far behind. and that's where you get the crises that we currently have of people who talk about transhumanism, and they're like, oh yeah, science is great, it's going to take us to the next phase of evolution, but it's devoid of morality. It's actually anti-moral, right? It's and listen to Yuval Harari saying, like, the global useless class. Science has rendered most of humanity useless, and the best we could do is maybe give them drugs and video games to occupy themselves while they wait for being culled by the elites, the game masters, right? So all that to say, this is the opposition to the manifest destiny idea, the idea that like they called it the Continental Congress as well. And it wasn't just the Congress of 13 colonies. And the idea was to get beyond the Alleghenies, the mountains that were separating the colonies from the inner continent. So the Continental Congress was always the idea that it was in the destiny of this new Republican order. And I say Republican with the small r, right? Like Plato and More and Augustine type of order of being able to extend civilization, but not to just suppress everybody into slavery or to pave over the world. It's rather to both, like extend civilization, but for the better. You can green a desert. You don't just have to abide by the chaos that's implicit in nature. Nature is good by itself, but we can make it better. It doesn't make that, by saying it, people would say, oh, that means you think that nature is bad. It's like, no, it doesn't mean that. It just means, it's like your chicken, like if my chicken gets too old to maintain, my pet chicken, I might have to put it down. If I can't afford to pay for my kids' milk or the chicken, I might have to put the chicken down and eat the chicken for food, But could I apply that to my grandma? No, scales are different scales, right? Like, grandma's getting very expensive. Do I put her down and eat her? No, you don't do that. So it's like, it doesn't make the chicken bad. So that was the idea. And so I'd say from the standpoint of my books of the Clash of the Two Americas, as well as the series on what has been Canada as a blockade against this idea of a proper manifest destiny as a tool of the British Venetian Empire in the Americas, it sort of tries to vector on that schism, including the fact that you have to identify, anybody looking at this can't just treat manifest destiny as a blanket good. There's also evil variants of it, which have given it a very bad name, that did extend, slavery and destruction to the world. And that's what the Pax Americana idea of the new Roman Empire of the neocons, that's where that comes from, is the evil manifest destiny. That we're the best of the best, the elite class, the exceptional stand. And the world is destined to be subdued by our power, says John Ashcroft,
Right.
And then you get the liberal variety too. Sorry, yeah.
No, I love this quote that the way you explain the positive conception of manifest destiny, where you say it's the creative overcoming of limits to growth by a spiritual, intellectual, and economic extension of the best of civilization, driven by a love for scientific and technological progress, where it's like, it's all of it. Like, it drives people to be their best. Like, that is the true essence of the manifest destiny, not this, like, you need to be what I want you to be, which is also like lower, below.
Yeah. Well, it's like a kid, right? Like, if you give a little child the opportunity, the kid's instincts are always to go beyond themselves, right? They're not going to just settle on, like, I'm happy with the 3 words I know now. They want to be better. They're modeling themselves. They're trying to leap outside of their limits. Luckily, they're not bogged down by as much ideology or ego, so they're more free at making these discoveries and picking up languages. And then
to learn and educate.
Yeah, it's just like that's right there. That's civilization. In a microcosm. So you just got to, like, let it be and give people the inspiration to want to be good and know that they should be. You're happier. You're not even that you should be good. It's that you'd be happier being good than satisfying your lower lusts that might result or will result in excess regret or pain in the future. Like, true pleasure should not ever cause pain. By like a Platonic line of reasoning, pleasure is self feeding. It's a principle. So anything masquerading as pleasure that results in pain in the form of like, I've had too much cake, or, you know, I regret my stupid decision to have cake, shame, you know, or whatever, right? Maybe he used pleasure. That's not real pleasure. It doesn't mean you shouldn't have cake, but that's why temperance exists too, right? To have wisdom guide your belly, not your belly guiding your wisdom. Right. So yeah, I think that overall, when you look at, again, to pull it back to the present, when you look at the overarching policy of the Eurasian Alliance today, which has said no to the demands for canceling their ancient civilizations, to homogenize themselves on this altar of LGBTQ XYZ, you know, effeminization of men in media and stuff, which Xi Jinping came down hard on, as well as just no depopulation, right? They're putting forth cameralist programs that involve making people smarter, not dumber, bringing them to a higher standard of life, not a worse. So, and also empowering sovereign nation states to have access to industry, not just be cash cropping single function zones, which is what globalization was wired on, or the British Empire was always wired on. You know, you're allowed to, you got a lot of like land, so you just do wheat. You can't do industry because you don't have industry, so you can't do that because it's not in your comparative advantage. That's the rule of John Stuart Mill, and all British philosophers. And so, you know, that's the opposite of what we see with full spectrum economies blossoming under the Belt and Road Initiative orientation. So anybody who says, again, China or Russia or any of their allies are just in on the Great Reset, they're not looking at things in a principled way. They're looking at it from the standpoint of pattern formation. Because why? Well, the Great Reset is based upon these formulas of central command, of you know, like they could miss the words sustainability, the words new economic order, things like that are all the words used by the Great Reset crowd, and everything evil. And thus, since I see similar words often being used by Eurasian leaders, and I see centralized commands there, I see I don't think China really, the surveillance state thing is I'm not a fan of that, but I wrote an article on social credit and the surveillance state of China as a distasteful necessity in an age of asymmetrical warfare. What was my thesis? I was like, well, if you look at what they're dealing with, it's not like there's a world of just nation states just coexisting. You've got an active war to destroy China, which is unbroken since the Opium Wars. That's ongoing, and deep state fifth column penetrations on every level that have been
all there.
Yeah, you know, those Opium Wars too, that happened right around the same time that they were destroying our second national bank during Jackson's time. You know what I mean? Like I just keep to see more and more like overlays again and again, because all the goodness that was coming out of the 1880s, or I should say 1860s, all the way to McKinley. But even before then, because they knocked out a couple presidents. Who was it? Remember, Matt, you mentioned
Harrison got knocked out.
Harrison.
And then Zachary Taylor. But Harrison was like, like based on your national bank point, like he had the legislation that had been passed in Senate and the House of Representatives to create a third national bank in 1840.
Desk.
Yeah, on his desk, waiting to be signed into law. And that's when, after 3 months of being the president, he like doesn't wake up one day, or I think he gets, I don't know, some stomach ailment and dies. So yeah, that disappeared fast. And as soon as he's dead, the entire Aaron Burr apparatus that had killed the national bank takes back control again. You got now the Freemasonic Southern slave power that soon takes control again in the 1850s, advancing and empowering the slave society, the slaveocracy even more. People like the Giuseppe Mazzini networks of Albert Pike become major power players in the federal government during this time before the Civil War. And Judah Benjamin, you know, this hardcore, nominally Jewish, but again, not really. He's like this hyper high level Freemason intelligence officer who's the Secretary of State of the Confederate Forces. Ends up like he's a high level power player federally, and then he becomes one of the players in the Confederate uprising. They're all being coordinated by Lord Palmerston, who was again one of the high level Freemasonic networks using a variety of hyper satanic lodges. And, you know, at the time, I've seen evidence that some of the lodges are fighting each other. Some of the lodges weren't taken over by the satanic element. And it's kind of like one of the things that's just part of, most people don't really have a technique of looking at this part when they're this aspect of history, because they tend to notice that there's Freemasonic activity in a lot of places. And they tend to, again, do that oversimplistic brush stroke like they do with the Jewish bankers or the Jews as a whole. It's like all evil. Freemasonry equals evil. So thus Ben Franklin or George Washington or Mozart are all equally as evil as Giuseppe Mazzini and Albert Pike and Hitler. Right. Well, I mean, Hitler was part of the Thule Society, different Masonic order, but still evil. So the thing is, there is evidence of different lodges having been created, trying to awaken or evoke a humanist tradition. That's even, I've mentioned that there's a humanist tradition in the Vatican. It's not all evil. There's a humanist tradition in Masonry too, going back to the days of ancient Athens and ancient Egypt, of city builders that saw human beings as something special that had to be made that were made in the image of God, and that had to be cultivated in that way to have their potential awoken. There's evidence of that going back a long time, always at war with this other thing that will use everything to its advantage and rot everything from the inside. So I would say by that point of the late 19th century, most of the positive elements of Freemasonry had been expunged for the most part, especially in Europe.
Hey, Matt, in 1812, or right prior to the War of 1812, and when the bank was up for renewal in 1811, right? The first bank of the United States. There's been always this out there in different literature talking about how Nathan Rothschild was going to say, you know, if you don't renew the charter, we're going to go to war with you. Like, there seems to be some confusion about what happened right in there around these banks, the war. I know Napoleon was over there doing, you know, like what is the truth about that? I'm just curious.
All right. So Napoleon was a bit of a mixed bag. There were good people inside of France, like Gaspard Monge and others, who had a lot of influence in the French courts and who avoided having their heads cut off during the 5 years of civil war, where the French Revolution, instead of becoming like an American Revolution, right, which it should have been, Ben Franklin organized really heavily to have that as the first. If it was going to become successful in France, then he had the stage set up for a series of follow-up chain reactions with a Polish Republican Revolution, British. You get people in Britain who were even like good people who were installed, well, that was going to probably happen way later. Anyway, in Prussia, you had that Beethoven and Mozart were both part of these circles, as was Schiller. So there was a lot of hope for this new age of reason that would replace the hereditary structures of might make right. And but it had to work in France, and that's why the British put so much effort. That's chapter, I think, 3 of my volume 1 of the Clash of the Two Americas. The British put a lot of effort into turning that into a Jacobin color revolution, where all of the qualified leaders were all equally labeled with you're part of an elite, you got riches, you're a scientist, off with your head, you know, and all the qualified people had their heads cut off along with corrupt people. It was just like the mob became weaponized, which was again used again in the Bolshevik period. It was again used all over the 20th century. It's being used again today. So the thing with France, when Napoleon came to power, at first he was promising to be like a Roman Republican consul. And people had hope. They were like, okay, you know, the Roman Republic wasn't so bad. It wasn't evil like the Empire. And it didn't take long for people to realize that, no, he meant the Empire. He didn't mean the Republic. But despite that, it was ongoing war for like 20 years from 1795. And the thing with the better people who represented that Augustinian tradition, like Gaspard Monge, who managed the École Polytechnique, these were people who they were able to influence Napoleon in a variety of ways at different times towards supporting good policies that were beneficial to the people. At other times, Napoleon's one of these, like, he's not his own man. You know, he's got a giant ego. very little frame of body and little other things. And so he's compensating for a lot. And you know, sorry, let me just let my cat out of my study here. Okay. So he's easily malleable. He's got people around him who will often use him as a tool to destroy. And sometimes when he's got a good advisor, he'll listen to them and be a tool, an instrument for some good. At a certain point, so he's not so easy to just characterize. Some people are, you can do that with some people, but not very many, in terms of like simplistically, okay, you're evil. I get it, consistently. Right. Some people are mixed. Napoleon, I would say, was a bit mixed. All that to say, to play into two elements, the bank and manifest destiny. A big part of manifest destiny as a policy, a successful one, came with the something negotiated primarily by Alexander Hamilton, even though it was Jefferson who signed it off. And Jefferson was, again, a mixed bag. Right. Not all good, not all bad. Right. Definitely big problem with slavery. The fact that he was really happy keeping his slaves in place and not even giving them their liberty after he died. Whereas at least Washington was like, okay, after I die, everybody can go free. Jefferson, no. not even the slave that like birthed his kids.
I know.
Yeah, it's like, what are you doing? So anyway, when he was president, Napoleon, who was short on funds, really needed cash. The idea of having French colonies in the Americas under Louisiana, like this whole Louisiana territory, was way too unsustainable. And so a negotiation was settled to buy Louisiana from Napoleon, which was perfectly good. I mean, that was that America grew something like, I don't know, what, 300% of its landmass or more was increased. Huge. By that point. Huge. And the idea always became, well, how do we then now bring civilization into this wilderness, right? There's a lot of variables. There are many native tribes who are friendly to us. Many native tribes have been commandeered by Jesuits from Quebec, which had a Jesuitical basing for a long time. I didn't even bring in the Jesuits into the story, and maybe that's for another show. But no, the Jesuits, they were cult creators. They would be able to, or at least the higher level, there's lower level Jesuits who meant well, but I think at the higher level, it kind of worked like a Masonic rite of initiation. And as you got up the hierarchical command structure, often in sort of Kabbalistic ways from what I'm seeing, when you look at like Ignatius Loyola's meditations, very Kabbalistic in terms of self-induced hypnotic trances to convince yourself that if your authority in the chain of command wills that white be black, then it must be so. And absolving yourself of the acts of sin committed by you, even if just because you were given an order to do something evil, it's not evil if it was given to you as an order by somebody who had the mandate of God in the chain of command, right? So that takes a lot of self-induced deconstructionism, which you again see with the Kabbalistic techniques as well. All that to say, so the pioneers had these elements of like Jesuitical psyop, mini cults that masqueraded with partial, like quasi-Christian groups of native bands, Algonquins and others, Mohawks, that had some of their tribal aspects mixed in and infused with the Jesuit handler as sort of the hand of God that everyone would treat kind of like a quasi-deity. And Schiller even writes about this phenomenon in the Jesuitical government of Paraguay. Anyway, whole other side note. So they had a lot of variables to deal with, but that they pushed on. The Lewis Clark work was one aspect of that. But coming out of this process, the National Bank, which was this was Hamilton's baby. This was like the thing that would give the US the economic sovereignty it needed to break free of being a cotton agricultural plantation export zone for Europe into becoming an economically sovereign, industrially advanced society, which it wasn't. It didn't have hardly any industry. Hardly any. And it was bankrupt after the American Revolution, totally bankrupt. Each state was bankrupt. They had no common currency. Every state was at war with each other. It was only a matter of time before the early states were going to be reabsorbed back into the British Empire during the 1780s. the Articles of Confederation were useless. I mean, there was no central government, there was no ability to enforce taxation or tariff, couldn't do anything. So yeah, like the Hamiltonian First National Bank was set up to resolve that, and it worked quite well in terms of creating a unified currency. It federalized all the state debts, and it created an ability to have things like, with the constitutional powers that were also coincident with that, it gave the federal government an ability to have a protectionist policy to favor the development of local industries. It provided credit for entrepreneurs, to have low interest, large scale credit for building for their business, but also big projects that were in the state and national interest, like the Erie Canal and other internal works. So this was all what created what's called an remember at the beginning of our conversation, I brought up entropy, anti-entropy. This was like really anti-entropic.
Right.
The American population went from, it quadrupled its population in the first 45 years under this policy by creating more wealth than you formerly had in the previous system. So the same money is moving around, but the buying power of the dollar is qualitatively now different than it was previous. So because your whole system has qualitatively upgraded, right? With new discoveries, new inventions, new productive processes, you're free from the old burdens, the old limits. So that worked. There was always a fifth column, especially inside of Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Party, of these what are called the Eastern Establishment families. The Cushings, later on the Harrimans came out of this, but I mean, a lot of these opium families who worked with the British on the opium wars, and opium, they made their wealth that way by stealing and selling drugs. They were concentrating themselves in the Federalist Party. So once Hamilton was killed, that became a party of mostly evil, the Pickerings, other things. And they were working hard to subvert the national bank from within. And, you know, yes, it had an allowance for private investors to have an interest in the bank, which is why people often say that it was a Rothschild bank, because it was private and sort of like a proto Federal Reserve 100 years before the Federal Reserve. That's the mythos that's been created.
Right.
Because they say, look, Hamilton he allowed private investors to buy in stock into the bank, so it's kind of like a quasi private bank. No, yes, he allowed private interest to buy stock, but he also made a point that to be on the board of directors or to be the head of the bank, you have to be an American. You can't be foreigner. He made a point that the federal constitution has to always be the driving force of the behavior of the bank. Policy can't be made from a foreign investor. A foreign investor, it's like a business. You can invest in a company and it will give you returns if it's a good investment, but it's not going to be the case that you can necessarily tell the company what to do.
Right.
And just look at the actions. Like I said, the population under the national bank, it quadrupled in a short period, which was like, it freaked out the Malthusians in England who were like, no, that's against the laws of population. You can't do that. You're going to cause more scarcity faster. So you had that. Now, at the same time, the bank's charter was ending. It was a 20-year charter. And Britain was adamant while they were fighting Napoleon, they were also fighting, Napoleon was also fighting Russia. So there was this French-Russian conflict that was starting. That's where Napoleon gets his ass kicked. Britain is using this opportunity during this period of conflict with Russia, which is now kicking in. It's getting hotter and hotter, to basically undo the American Revolution. There's a lot of chaos inside of the USA still. The fifth column is amplifying their power after Hamilton is killed. Keep in mind, Hamilton, though he doesn't like Jefferson, he fought like hell to make sure Jefferson became president.
So Burr wouldn't get there. Yeah.
Because he was evil. Yeah. And he knew Jefferson was like one of these mixed bag characters. I don't like him, but he's not a traitor. He's not going to willfully kill his country the way Burr openly wants to. Like, Burr was at the heart of 3 different attempts to dissolve the Union and put himself as dictator of either the Northern Confederacy or the Western Confederacy that would take part of Louisiana and basically depose of the sitting president Jefferson in 1807. And set himself up as the pro-British king of the USA, and that's what he was caught. That's why he left America, to avoid arrest. He didn't leave him. He didn't escape America after he killed Hamilton in a duel. People sometimes think that it wasn't 1804 that he killed Hamilton and he was happy. But it was 3 years later after he was caught, and there was a court case where there was whistleblowers who were in on the conspiracy that was run out of Andrew Jackson's house.
Yeah.
He becomes the war hero in the
See,
war
man,
with
that's
Britain.
what we're talking about.
And then mysteriously shows back up right before the War of 1812.
Super convenient, like weeks before, yeah. And immediately, like,
come
he just
on.
starts after 5 years of doing what? What's he doing in England? The guy's living in the house, the manor of Jeremy Bentham, the head of British intelligence. And in his diaries, he's saying that this is the best time of my life. What is he doing at Bentham's house? The guy who like writes in defense of pederasty, hardcore opium, prostitutes,
Debauchery.
orgies. Like, this is
All of
Hellfire
it.
Club stuff that Aaron Burr is just like sucking it all in.
Basking in.
And having meetings with Lord Castlereagh, the guy who's orchestrating the Congress of Vienna, the restoration of oligarchies in England in 1815.
Wow.
That's bringing back the Jesuits into the power play from Europe, because they had been expelled for 50 years from Europe, right? From 1773, the Pope, who dies of probably poisoning months afterwards, he expels the Jesuits. I think it's Clement III, and they're not allowed to be in Europe. And they're gone for 50 years. Their new seat of operations is Moscow. And it's only with the Congress of Vienna that the Jesuits are reinstated as a police force to enforce the oligarchical structures. So, you got this whole thing, and this is who Aaron Burr is meeting before he's then like set up with a new game plan to go back into the US right when Britain is about to declare war. And there's a whole, I mean, it's messy. There's books that have been written about like the causes of the war, but I guarantee you, it is not because the Rothschilds wanted a second national bank. There is no evidence that that's actually true. There are accusations that people just say it, and because it fits within an explanatory model that they're really emotionally connected to, they just like take it in, and they're like, yeah, that's exactly what happened. They wanted the Federal Reserve, and that's why the War of 1812 happened. No, not at all. And it was coming out of the War of 1812 that's where you have, or during that war, which only ends a couple of years later, that's where Aaron Burr is the first person on record to write, I think, to his nephew, that we have to put all of our efforts into getting Andrew Jackson elected president, the guy who basically turns the US from a citizenry that could think in a sovereign way into a mob of frenzy of people who would just, give up their individuality to abide by some like mob rule. And that was what democracy became under Jackson, especially. It was already going down that path with Jefferson. And everybody thought, oh yeah, he beat the bank. What a great guy. He killed the bank and he paid the debt. What a hero. It's like, no, what happened once he killed the bank? Bank panic, right? Like right away, he completely deregulates the economy, gets rid of protectionism, brings in British Adam Smith free trade speculation. The banking system goes haywire. He pays off the debt, sure, but then what else happens? Well, what was the debt doing? It was funding the Erie
Building
Canal.
the country.
Yeah, all of the projects, the internal improvements were all seized up. They stopped being built, and everybody went bankrupt who were doing things that were productive. So it's like what the IMF has been demanding that Greece or other nations do. Like you got to do austerity to pay your debt and stop your internal improvements and privatize your state companies to pay your debt. That's your number one sin, is not paying debt. So he died, that's how he dies happy, with his tombstone saying, I paid the debt. And yeah, the US is broken up. Every state is all of a sudden granted the authorization again, like in the Articles of Confederation, to like issue their own local currencies. There's like 2,500 local currencies all of a sudden being created. No harmony of the nation, no ability to get anything done, and things just dissolve and dissolve and dissolve until you get, the slave power rising and rising and rising in power, because the British love buying cotton from the Confederate South. They become like the most economically powerful like zone of the world behind Britain. So it's money bags, corruption, the whole way through, and that's what Lincoln has to then resolve.
That's pretty amazing too, that we had Madison, Monroe, and John Quincy Adams. Like those Brits had a lot to infiltrate with those three in there to even get, like Burr must have been working overtime to get Jackson even in there with those guys before him, is what I'm thinking.
Oh, man, yeah. Absolutely. No,
Like those are power hitters that were changing our country and putting us right on track, you know?
oh yeah, no, I mean, you're really,
Ah,
it's amazing the moral insight from leaders in those days before
right.
Jackson. It was such high quality, and yet, despite that, there was still something of a cultural Achilles heel that the British were able to identify, capitalize on, inflame, and cause us to, and I say us, collectively. My heart,
Sure.
my heart is American in that sense.
Yeah.
But to undermine ourselves and to do the things that Shakespeare was trying to warn us not to do when he was writing his tragedies. Don't be like a Hamlet. Don't be a Romeo and Juliet. That's his tragedies were like a messaging to the people to say, okay, well, when you have great potential and you give into lower prejudices and your lower self and all these things, you will be a tool for evil and you will undermine yourself. And that's what happened with the people giving their support to the new parasite class.
Yeah,
and
as we would say,
acquiescing to like
sabotage.
killing natives, the Trail of Tears that Andrew Jackson led. I mean, holy shit, the killing of thousands of Cherokee and emptying out all of the areas that the Cherokee had been living on for generations, emptying them out, and then giving that land over to the slave power oligarchy to then run cotton. That was, to say he was like somehow a patriot is the biggest lie. I mean, this guy was the Rothschild stooge, and they've convinced us in a lot of these like reframing of narratives that actually the Rothschild stooge is the great hero, and the great hero who dies, who's shot defending his country at Hamilton, is the Rothschild stooge who's evil, we're told. It's like the Khazarians, like the one of the key areas that was instrumental in defeating the stranglehold of Venice and the empire, as part of this ecumenical alliance, is the evil one. And if anything, Venice is the poor victim of the Jews. It's like they just turn everything inside out by giving us a lot of truth. Like, oh, the Twin Towers was an inside job. Kennedy was killed by an inside job, don't you? You know that there's international bankers, right? Don't you? Yeah, we know that too. Here's how it all happened. And then once your inner sentinels are down, right? Because you trust this person, it's like they know what you know, but they know so much more now. And now you're like a kid, just give it to me. Yeah, all the Trojan horses. Right?
That's how I feel like with you. I'm like,
well, hey, we've gone on a long time. We probably want, we could probably keep going, but let's do another one at another time when you can fit us in. We could pick right up off of where we just left and keep rolling.
Absolutely, let's do it. And yeah, Cynthia and I are just finishing volume 3 of the
we can't wait.
America, so maybe that could be a good Kickstarter.
Yeah, hey, here they are. Let's show the books. Let's show these books. Oh, you got that one. I got the first one.
Wonderful.
His books and the Untold History of Canada, which I read the first 2 already and half the third. And
you're ahead of me. I'm like, I gotta. It's like I have to train my brain again to learn how to like read and absorb so much information. Like it's so cool, but I'm just like, okay, I gotta like read and then process, read and then process.
I hear you. No, it's good. It's good. No, I tell people like, people are like, oh, what's your secret? Like, how do you do research? Do you read, like, do you have speed reading techniques or something? I'm like, no. Read slowly. I read very slowly and I reread pages several times over and think about it, because
exactly.
People who try to like process too much and nothing stays in there, and it's like, no, it's not the way to do it. And it's hard in this day of like information overload. We're all fighting it. I fight it, going on Telegram and like trying to keep up with like world events, and everything's like splattering at you.
Yeah. You probably do way more than I can. I just can't handle so much. It's like, got to keep it to a minimum. But I do enjoy reading.
Well, one good thing is my friend in Ottawa, Hugh Trudeau, he's got a wonderful professional acting voice, and he just narrated volume 1. So that's pretty much done now. And I'm just trying to figure out how to upload that so people will be able to get the audiobook version finally. And so I think that'll probably help if I think there's more audio options for a lot of these books and articles.
Yeah, I know I learn well by listening too. So that would be fantastic. That was a huge job.
Yeah. Well, it was only the volume 1. And it was a huge job. It was crazy.
But even volume 1.
Hey, anything we can do to help educate people, right? I mean, obviously we're all being more creative to do Zooms, or like even you taking your lectures that you guys probably used to do in person, taking them out to the Zoom. like we're trying to be as adaptable as we can to the culture kind of, and at the same time not lose any of our heart and soul in the midst of it all. I think is important, you know.
Well, that's the challenge, right? Like how you use technological advance always has like a bit of a corrupting quality, in the sense that as soon as you have something more technologically advanced than you previously did, you will have more abundance in some ways, right? You'll have less reliance on your memory. Like if you have now the written word, that technology all of a sudden renders your obligation to have the muscle memory. You don't have to have those muscles anymore. You can rely on the written word. So your obligation to use those things diminishes. You know, just even having my phone now. I remember when I was in the 90s, before I had one of these things, I used to I had like 30 phone numbers in my memory when I was a kid.
Of course you did.
Yeah, we all did, right?
Yeah.
And now I can't remember 2, you know, like I got mine.
I literally forgot my husband's phone number the other day. I was like, trying to punch it in, and I was like, shit, I was like, what is it? I'm like, I should definitely know his number.
Exactly. So like the Yuval Harari types would be like, well, that just means that human beings are destined to be irrelevant as AI and machines replace us. And, you know,
I think having these conversations prove that we are more than that. Like
exactly.
Definitely.
Best of all possible worlds.
Yes.
All right. Guys, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, we'll definitely we'll put all your links down. We'll have Brandi send you the tape so you can, you know, do as you guys wish with it. And yeah, man, much love and lots of blessings to you and Cynthia. Thanks so much, Matt. For
much love to you guys too. It's always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our continuation.
Absolutely.
Right on, have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.